The divorce papers landed on the mahogany desk with a finality that echoed through the sterile conference room. But the man who received them didn't flinch. He simply stared at the woman who had shared his bed for 3 years, unaware he is the real owner of the multi-billion-dollar company her entire family worked for. She served him divorce papers for being too poor to marry a real estate agent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she stood there in her designer suit, her manicured nails drumming against her Hermes briefcase. But her eyes held nothing except contempt for the man she believed scraped by on a janitor's salary. Her father occupied the executive suite 15 floors above them. Her mother managed the Western regional operations. Her brothers controlled the marketing and legal departments, but none of them knew the quiet man in the maintenance uniform owned every brick, every contract, every share of the empire they called their livelihood. The irony twisted through the air like poison, but she couldn't taste it. She only tasted her ambition, her hunger for a partner who could match her 6-figure income and her luxury lifestyle. What would she do when the truth shattered her perfectly constructed world? How would her family react when they discovered they had been working for the man they mocked at holiday dinners? Could a woman who valued wealth above everything survive the revelation that she had discarded the richest man she would ever know? The morning began like any other morning for Daniel Cooper, but today would be the day his carefully maintained disguise would crumble. He pushed the maintenance cart through the marble corridors of Titanium Holdings headquarters, his navy blue coveralls starched and clean, but his mind wandered to the envelope waiting in his locker, the divorce papers his wife Jessica had promised to deliver. The wheels of his cart squeaked against the polished floor, but no one looked at him. Invisible was exactly what he had cultivated for the past 5 years. Jessica Morrison, she had kept her maiden name, claiming it sounded more professional, sat in her corner office on the 42nd floor, but her thoughts were miles away from the property listings spread across her glass desk. She tapped her Mont Blanc pen against her teeth, calculating the timing of her exit strategy. The divorce would be finalized within 60 days, but she needed to ensure her transition to Gregory Blackwell's penthouse apartment happened seamlessly. Gregory, the real estate developer with the Tesla and the beach house in Malibu, but more importantly, the man who didn't smell like industrial cleaner when he came home. The fluorescent lights in the maintenance break room flickered as Daniel opened his locker, but the envelope wasn't there yet. His phone buzzed, a text from Jessica. Conference room 7B, 2 p.m. Don't be late. The coldness in those words cut deeper than any blade, but he had expected nothing less. She had been pulling away for months, her disgust growing more evident with each passing week. What Jessica didn't know, what no one except Daniel's lawyer and accountant knew, was that the maintenance worker identity was a carefully constructed facade. 10 years ago, Daniel had inherited Titanium Holdings from his grandfather, Benjamin Cooper, but the inheritance came with a condition: spend 5 years working anonymously within the company, understanding every level of operation before taking his rightful place. Benjamin had built the empire from nothing, but he had watched too many trust fund heirs destroy their legacies through ignorance and arrogance. You'll know the company from the ground up, Benjamin had told him in the hospital, his weathered hands gripping Daniel's with surprising strength. You'll see who your employees really are when they don't know you're watching, and most importantly, you'll understand that the man who empties the trash cans is just as valuable as the man who signs the checks. But those words felt hollow now as Daniel faced the dissolution of his marriage. The clock on the wall ticked toward 2 o'clock, but Daniel found himself frozen in the break room. Marcus, no, he had to stop using that name even in his thoughts. David Thompson, his college roommate and current VP of operations, walked past without a second glance. David didn't recognize him. The weight loss, the buzzed haircut, the colored contacts that changed his eyes from green to brown, but most effectively, the posture of a man who had been beaten down by life rather than elevated by privilege. Jessica's entire family had infiltrated Titanium Holdings like a calculated invasion. Her father, Richard Morrison, had been hired as chief financial officer 3 years ago, but his credentials were impressive enough that Daniel, operating through his proxy board of directors, had approved the appointment. Richard was brilliant with numbers, but his personality was caustic. He treated maintenance staff like vermin, but he generated profits that made shareholders happy. Catherine Morrison, Jessica's mother, ran the Western Regional operations with an iron fist, but her results were undeniable. She had expanded Titanium's real estate portfolio by 40% in 2 years, but she had also created a culture of fear among her subordinates. Daniel had watched her reduce a facilities coordinator to tears over a misplaced file, but the proxy board praised her efficiency. The Morrison brothers were equally problematic. Thomas, the older one, headed marketing with innovative campaigns that won industry awards, but he routinely took credit for his team's ideas. Christopher, the younger, practiced law with a shark's mentality in the legal department, but his ethics were questionable at best. Daniel had observed him burying discrimination complaints with settlement agreements that protected the company but not the victims. Jessica had joined the family empire 2 years ago, transitioning from a boutique real estate firm to Titanium's commercial properties division. She was good at her job. Daniel couldn't deny that, but her ambition consumed her. She closed deals worth millions, but she measured her worth against the zeros in her commission checks. The conference room felt like a tomb when Daniel arrived at 1:58 p.m., but he refused to show weakness. Jessica sat at the head of the table, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her beauty was undeniable even in her coldness. Her sister, Amanda Morrison, sat beside her, moral support, apparently, but Amanda's presence added another layer of humiliation. "You're early," Jessica said without looking up from her phone, but her tone suggested early was the same as late in her assessment. Daniel took a seat at the opposite end of the table, but he didn't speak. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "I'll make this quick," Jessica continued, sliding a manila folder across the table. "I've had my lawyer draw up the papers. You'll keep your personal items, your car, though I can't imagine why you'd want that rusted Honda, but everything we purchased together stays with me. Considering I paid for 95% of it, that seems fair." But fair was a concept that had lost all meaning in their relationship. Amanda shifted uncomfortably, but she remained silent. She had always been the kinder Morrison sibling, working as a pediatric nurse rather than joining the family's corporate ventures, but even she looked at Daniel with a mixture of pity and relief that her sister was finally escaping this mistake. "The condo, the furniture, the artwork, all mine," Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to her subject. "I'm being generous by not asking for alimony, given that I've been the primary breadwinner throughout our marriage, but I want this done cleanly." But clean was impossible when betrayal ran this deep. Daniel picked up the folder, but he didn't open it. "When did you decide I wasn't enough?" The question caught Jessica off guard, but she recovered quickly. "When did you decide that ambition was a dirty word?" "I married someone I thought would grow, Daniel. I thought you were working maintenance temporarily while you figured things out. But 3 years later, you're still pushing that cart, still coming home smelling like garbage, still content with mediocrity." But she had no idea what contentment actually meant. "I have a stable job," Daniel said quietly, but his words sounded weak even to his own ears. "Stable?" Jessica laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "You make $38,000 a year. Do you know what I made last quarter? Last quarter alone, $215,000. I'm closing a waterfront development deal next week that will net me $500,000 in commission. I can't be married to someone who cleans toilets while I'm negotiating 8-figure contracts. But she had never asked why he stayed in that position. Amanda touched her sister's arm, but Jessica shook her off. Gregory is everything you're not, Jessica continued, but now she was being cruel for cruelty's sake. He's successful, ambitious, respected. He drives a car that costs more than you make in 5 years. He doesn't come home with dirty fingernails and exhaustion. He takes me to restaurants with Michelin stars, not diners with plastic menus. But Gregory was also leveraged to his eyeballs in debt. Daniel knew this because Titanium Holdings held the mortgages on 3 of Gregory's properties. When did you start seeing him? Daniel asked, but he already knew the answer. Jessica's face flushed, but she didn't deny it. That's not relevant to these proceedings. It's relevant to me, Daniel pressed, but his voice remained level. 6 months ago, Jessica admitted, but she showed no remorse. I met him at a property investors conference. He was everything I needed, everything I deserved. And before you ask, yes, he knows I'm married. He knows I'm leaving you for him. He's proud of it, actually. Says it shows I'm not the type to settle. But Gregory didn't know he was about to become homeless when Daniel foreclosed on his properties. Daniel finally opened the folder, but he didn't read the contents. You want me to sign this today? Yes, Jessica said firmly, but her eyes flickered with something, anxiety, perhaps. My lawyer is filing the papers tomorrow. I want to move forward with my life, Daniel. I've wasted enough time. But time would reveal who had wasted what. The door to the conference room opened, but everyone assumed it was a mistake. A woman in a designer suit entered carrying a leather portfolio, but her expression was all business. Behind her came David Thompson, the VP of Operations, and Margaret Chen, the head of HR. But their presence made no sense in this context. I'm sorry to interrupt, the woman said, but her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. But there's been a development that requires immediate attention. She looked directly at Daniel, but her expression was respectful. Reverent, even. Jessica stood up, her irritation evident, but she tried to maintain her professional demeanor. This is a private meeting. Whatever this is about can wait. I'm afraid it can't, Ms. Morrison, the woman replied, but now she was looking at Jessica with something approaching pity. My name is Helen Rodriguez, and I'm the Chief Legal Counsel for Titanium Holdings. This meeting directly concerns matters of corporate governance and family law. But her words were deliberately cryptic. Amanda's eyes widened, but Jessica just looked confused. I don't understand. Why would Titanium's legal counsel interrupt my divorce proceedings? Helen turned to Daniel, but her body language shifted to something resembling a bow. Mr. Cooper, we've received word that your 5-year mandate concluded at midnight last night. The board has been informed, and they're requesting your presence at an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. But Helen's words were falling on ears that couldn't comprehend them. Jessica's face went pale, but she still didn't understand. Mr. Cooper, his name is Daniel Morrison. He took my last name when we got married because he said, his legal name is Daniel Benjamin Cooper, Helen interrupted, but her voice was gentle now. He's the majority shareholder and rightful CEO of Titanium Holdings. He has been since his grandfather's death 5 years ago. But the truth was still too large to grasp. The silence in the conference room was deafening, but Daniel could hear Jessica's breathing become rapid and shallow. Amanda had covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes were fixed on Daniel as if seeing him for the first time. That's impossible, Jessica whispered, but her voice cracked. He's a maintenance worker. He cleans bathrooms. He empties trash cans. He makes $38,000 a year. But each statement was a nail in the coffin of her understanding. David Thompson stepped forward, but his expression was apologetic. Daniel, Mr. Cooper, worked in maintenance as part of his grandfather's succession plan. Benjamin Cooper required that his heir spend 5 years working anonymously within the company before assuming control. I was one of 3 people who knew his true identity. But David's revelation only deepened the wound. Jessica's knees buckled, but she caught herself on the table. No, this is some kind of joke. Daniel, tell them this is a joke. But Daniel's silence was confirmation enough. The company your entire family works for, Helen continued, but now her words carried the weight of destiny, is owned by the man you just served, with divorce papers. Your father reports to a board of directors that Daniel appointed. Your mother's regional operations are funded by Daniel's capital. Your brother's departments exist because Daniel approved their budgets. But the full scope of the revelation was still unfolding. Amanda found her voice first. Jessica, I think you need to sit down. But Jessica remained standing, but her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. Why? Why would you do this? Why would you let me believe you were nobody? But her questions were accusations. Daniel stood slowly, but his posture had changed. No longer the hunched shoulders of a tired maintenance worker, but the straight spine of a man who had carried a massive secret for half a decade. My grandfather wanted me to understand this company from the inside. He wanted me to know which employees treated others with respect and which ones showed their true character when they thought no one important was watching. But his words carried no malice, only exhaustion. Your entire family failed that test, David added, but Helen shot him a warning look. Jessica's face cycled through emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally calculation. So you're rich. You've been rich this whole time. You let me work myself to death while you played dress-up? But she was already recalibrating, already seeing the angles. I worked just as hard as anyone in that maintenance crew, Daniel replied, but his voice was firm. Probably harder because I was trying to learn every system, every process, every relationship. I've spent 5 years on my feet for 12 hours a day, doing work that you and your family consider beneath you. But his resentment was finally surfacing. The divorce, Jessica said suddenly, but now her voice had changed, softer, pleading. We don't have to go through with it. Daniel, honey, we can work this out. I was just stressed, just scared about our financial future. But if I had known... But her performance was transparent. If you had known, you would have treated me differently, Daniel finished. But his tone was ice. That's exactly the problem, Jessica. You loved me conditionally, only if I met your financial requirements. You respected me only when you thought I could elevate your status. But the truth was laid bare now. Amanda stood and moved toward her sister, but Jessica pushed her away. Don't touch me. Don't you dare pity me. But Jessica's pride was all she had left. Helen cleared her throat, but she was clearly uncomfortable with the emotional display. Mr. Cooper, there are some additional matters we need to discuss regarding the Morrison family's employment at Titanium Holdings. But her implication was clear. Fire them, Jessica said bitterly, but she was past caring. That's what you're going to do, right? Fire my entire family because your ego can't handle being rejected. But her understanding was still incomplete. Daniel shook his head, but his expression was sad rather than angry. I'm not going to fire anyone, Jessica. Your father is good at his job, despite his personality flaws. Your mother gets results, even if her methods are questionable. Your brothers contribute to the company's success. I'm not a vindictive person, but his mercy was almost harder to bear than punishment would have been. However, Helen interjected, but her lawyer's instinct for precision took over. There will be some organizational changes. A new CEO will be implementing new policies regarding workplace culture and treatment of staff at all levels. Those who cannot adapt to a more respectful environment may find themselves incompatible with the company's future direction. But the warning was unmistakable. Jessica collapsed into the chair, but her designer suit suddenly looked like a costume. I threw away a billionaire. I served divorce papers to a billionaire because I thought he was poor. But her laugh was hysterical. Do you know how insane that sounds? But insanity and reality had merged. You threw away a marriage because your husband didn't meet your financial expectations, Daniel corrected, but his voice was gentle now. The dollar amount doesn't change the fact that you valued money over partnership. If I had been a teacher or a nurse or a social worker, honorable professions that don't pay much, would I have been unworthy of your love? But his question cut to the heart of everything. Amanda spoke up, but her voice was thick with emotion. She's my sister and I love her, but you deserve better, Daniel. You deserved better than how she treated you. But Amanda's honesty was brave. Everyone deserves better than to be valued only for their net worth, Daniel agreed. But he was looking at Jessica with something approaching compassion. I hope Gregory makes you happy, Jessica. I genuinely do. But I think you should know that Titanium Holdings holds the mortgages on 3 of his properties, and he's currently 4 months behind on payments. He's facing foreclosure within 60 days, unless he can come up with approximately $2 million. But the revelation was delivered without cruelty. Jessica's face went from pale to green, but she managed to whisper, "You're lying." Helen pulled out a tablet and brought up several documents, but Jessica refused to look. I'm afraid Mr. Cooper is accurate. Gregory Blackwell's financial position is significantly worse than his lifestyle would suggest. He's an excellent salesman, including selling an image of success that doesn't match his actual situation. But reality was undefeated. The door opened again, but this time Richard Morrison entered, followed by Catherine. They had been summoned by David, but they didn't know why. When they saw the tableau in the conference room, their daughter collapsed in a chair, strangers in expensive suits, and the maintenance worker they barely acknowledged standing at the center of it all. But confusion was painted across their faces. "What's going on here?" Richard demanded, but his CFO authority voice didn't work in this context. "Jessica, why are you meeting with facility staff in a conference room?" But his disdain was reflexive. "Dad?" Jessica whispered, but she couldn't continue. Helen stepped forward, but her posture was professionally neutral. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, I'm Helen Rodriguez, Chief Legal Counsel for Titanium Holdings. I need to inform you that you've been in the presence of Daniel Cooper, the majority shareholder and CEO of this company." But the bomb was dropped with bureaucratic efficiency. Richard's face went through the same cycle of emotions as his daughter's, but he landed on anger faster. "That's absurd. Daniel Cooper is— Wait, you mean—" But his mind was working through the implications. "The janitor you yelled at last month for not emptying your trash fast enough," David supplied, but his tone was sharp. "The maintenance worker you've passed in the hallways for 3 years without a single acknowledgement, your son-in-law." But David's loyalty to Daniel was evident. Catherine's hand flew to her chest, but she had enough corporate instinct to understand the danger immediately. "Mr. Cooper, if we've given any offense, please understand that we had no idea." But her apology was survival instinct. "You had no idea I was important," Daniel interrupted, but his words were measured. "So you felt entitled to treat me and others in similar positions with contempt. That's not an excuse, Mrs. Morrison, that's the problem." But his judgment was fair. Thomas and Christopher arrived next, summoned by their mother's frantic texts, but they walked into a situation that defied comprehension. The youngest Morrison brother, barely 30, looked at Daniel in his maintenance uniform, and then at the assembled executives, but his confusion was almost comical. Someone want to explain why we're having a family reunion with the cleaning crew? Christopher asked, but his attempt at humor fell flat. The cleaning crew owns the company, Amanda said quietly, but her voice carried across the room. Daniel is Daniel Cooper. He's been undercover or whatever for 5 years, and Jessica just served him divorce papers for being too poor. But Amanda's summary was brutally concise. The Morrison family stood frozen, but their expressions ranged from horror to calculation. Thomas, ever the marketer, was already thinking about spin control. Christopher, the lawyer, was assessing liability, but their parents were simply trying to process the magnitude of their mistake. I'm going to make this very simple, Daniel said, but he addressed the entire family. You're all competent at your jobs. Some of you are even excellent. I'm not going to terminate anyone based on personal relationships or hurt feelings. But starting tomorrow, I'm implementing new standards for how employees treat each other, regardless of position or title. But his mercy came with conditions. There will be mandatory training on workplace respect and dignity, Helen added, reading from her tablet. There will be anonymous reporting systems for harassment and discrimination. There will be consequences for creating hostile work environments, no matter how good someone's numbers are. But the revolution was beginning. And Jessica, Daniel said, turning to his wife, soon to be ex-wife, but his expression was impossible to read. I'm going to sign these divorce papers. I'm going to give you everything you asked for in the settlement. The condo, the furniture, the artwork, all yours. But his generosity was confusing. Why? Jessica asked, but tears were finally streaming down her face. Why would you give me anything after what I've done? But she knew she deserved nothing. Because the things you're taking are just things, Daniel replied, but his voice was soft. They're replaceable. What you threw away, trust, partnership, genuine connection, those are not. I'm letting you walk away with the material items because they matter to you more than they ever mattered to me. But his lesson was profound. And Gregory, Jessica whispered, but she already knew the answer. I'm going to work out a payment plan with him, Daniel said, but he wasn't doing it for Gregory. Not because I'm charitable, but because foreclosing on his properties would harm the tenants living in those buildings. I'm thinking about the single mothers and elderly couples and struggling families who would be displaced. Not about him and not about you. But his principles were consistent. Richard Morrison found his voice, but it was stripped of its usual authority. Mr. Cooper, Daniel, I know apologies are insufficient, but I want you to know that I had no idea. If I had known... But Daniel cut him off with a raised hand. That's the third time someone has said, if I had known in this conversation, Daniel observed, but his tone was more sad than angry. None of you seem to understand that your behavior shouldn't change based on someone's net worth or position. The maintenance worker deserves the same basic human respect as the CEO. That's not a radical concept. But it was radical in their world. The conference room had become a courtroom, but Daniel was a judge who showed mercy even as he pronounced guilt. He signed the divorce papers with a pen Helen provided, but his hand was steady. Jessica watched him sign away their marriage, but she was seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. There's one more thing, David said, but he was looking at his phone with an expression of concern. The preliminary board meeting starts in 15 minutes. Mr. Cooper, they're expecting you to attend as yourself, not in disguise. But the transition was beginning. Daniel looked down at his coveralls, but he smiled for the first time since entering the conference room. I suppose I should change. But the simple statement carried enormous weight. I had your office prepared last week, Helen said, but she was already moving toward the door. Complete with a wardrobe appropriate for executive meetings. Your grandfather's desk is there, along with some of his personal items that have been in storage. But she had been planning for this moment. As Daniel moved to leave, but Jessica called out one last time. "Will I ever see you again?" But her question was plaintive. Daniel paused in the doorway, but he didn't turn around. "We'll probably encounter each other in the building, but Jessica, I think it's important that you understand something. I'm not angry at you. I'm disappointed, yes. Hurt, absolutely. But anger requires energy. I'd rather spend building something better." But his forgiveness was complete, even if reconciliation was impossible. "What happens now?" Amanda asked, but she was the only Morrison who seemed genuinely concerned, for Daniel rather than for the family's employment status. "Now I do the job I was born to do," Daniel replied, but he finally turned to face them all. "I'm going to run this company the way my grandfather envisioned, with integrity, compassion, and respect for every single person who contributes to its success. From the mailroom to the boardroom, everyone matters." But his vision was revolutionary for a corporate environment. 3 months later, the changes at Titanium Holdings were transformative but subtle. Daniel had taken his position as CEO, but he maintained a visible presence throughout the building. He still knew every maintenance worker by name, but now he also led executive strategy meetings. The Morrison family remained employed, but they had undergone significant personal transformations. Richard had enrolled in leadership coaching, but the process was humbling for a man who had always believed he had nothing to learn. Catherine had implemented her own version of Daniel's respect initiatives in her regional operations, but her teams were responding with increased loyalty and productivity. Thomas had started crediting his marketing team publicly, but the change had improved morale and creativity. Christopher had begun pro bono work with employment discrimination cases, but he was defending the victims rather than protecting the companies. Jessica had moved in with Gregory briefly, but the relationship imploded when his financial situation became impossible to hide. She had tried to reach out to Daniel multiple times, but he had maintained professional boundaries. She still worked at Titanium Holdings, but her perspective on success had begun to shift. She had witnessed Daniel's leadership style, firm but compassionate, demanding but fair. But she recognized the qualities she had failed to value when they mattered. Amanda had become an unexpected ally, but she visited Daniel occasionally for coffee and conversation. She never mentioned her sister unless Daniel asked, but she had apologized on behalf of her family even though Daniel insisted it wasn't necessary. The divorce had been finalized, but Daniel had indeed given Jessica everything she had requested. She lived in their former condo, surrounded by expensive furniture and artwork that now felt hollow. But she had learned a lesson that no business school could teach, that poverty and wealth were states of mind as much as states of account balance. Daniel sat in his grandfather's office, but he had made few changes to the decor. The old man's favorite quote hung on the wall: "Character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you." But Daniel had lived that principle even when it cost him his marriage. His assistant knocked on the door, but her smile was genuine. She had been part of the maintenance crew, and Daniel had promoted her when he discovered her organizational genius. "Mr. Cooper, you have a visitor. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's personal." But her tone suggested she knew who it was. "Send her in," Daniel said, but he already knew it would be Jessica. She entered his office, but she was different somehow. Less polished, less armored. She wore jeans and a simple blouse rather than her usual designer outfit, but the change suited her. She looked younger, more authentic. "I know I don't have the right to be here," Jessica began, but Daniel gestured to the chair across from his desk. "You have as much right as anyone," Daniel replied, but he kept his tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" But his formality maintained necessary distance. I wanted to apologize, Jessica said, but her hands twisted in her lap. Not because I want you back or because I'm trying to manipulate you, but because you deserve to hear that I was wrong about everything. But her apology seemed genuine. Daniel leaned back in his chair, but he didn't speak. He let the silence encourage her to continue. I measured my worth by my bank account, Jessica admitted, but tears were forming in her eyes. I measured everyone's worth that way. I thought that's what success looked like. The designer clothes, the expensive dinners, the impressive title. But watching you these past 3 months, seeing how people respond to you, understanding the kind of leader you are. But she had to pause to compose herself. I threw away something irreplaceable because I was too shallow to recognize its value, she continued, but her voice broke. You would have been an amazing husband if I had been a better wife. You would have been my partner, my support, my friend. But I only saw you as a paycheck that wasn't big enough. But her self-awareness had come too late. I appreciate you saying that, Daniel replied, but his expression was kind. Growth requires recognizing our mistakes. You're doing that, and I respect it. But respect wasn't the same as reconciliation. I don't expect forgiveness, Jessica said quickly, but she wanted him to understand. I just needed you to know that I understand what I lost, and I'm sorry. But her apology was complete. Daniel stood and walked to the window, but Manhattan stretched out below him in all its complicated glory. Jessica, I forgave you months ago. Holding on to anger would have poisoned me, not you. But forgiveness doesn't mean we can go back. We can't. But his honesty was gentle. I know, Jessica whispered, but she accepted the truth. I just wanted to thank you, actually, for not destroying my career or my family. You had every right to, but you chose mercy instead. But gratitude looked different on her. Revenge is easy, Daniel said, but he was still looking out the window. Building something better takes real work. I'd rather spend my energy on the latter. But his philosophy was consistent. Jessica stood to leave, but she paused at the door. For what it's worth, I hope you find someone who appreciates you for who you are, not what you have. You deserve that. But her wish seemed sincere. I hope you find what you're looking for too, Daniel replied, but he finally met her eyes. Whatever that turns out to be. But his good wishes were genuine. After she left, but Daniel returned to his desk and pulled out a photograph from the drawer. His grandfather stared back at him, but the old man's eyes seemed to twinkle with approval. The 5-year test had been brutal, but it had revealed truths that Daniel needed to know. About his company, about his employees, about human nature, but most importantly, about himself. He had entered Titanium Holdings as a maintenance worker, but he emerged as a leader who understood that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars. He had lost a wife who valued money over character, but he had gained a deeper understanding of what really mattered. He had been disrespected and dismissed, but he had used those experiences to build a more compassionate corporate culture. The intercom buzzed, but his assistant's voice came through clearly. Mr. Cooper, the board is ready for your quarterly presentation. But duty called. Daniel picked up his portfolio, but he smiled at his grandfather's photograph one last time. I think I passed your test, Grandpa, he whispered. But the old man's wisdom echoed in the office, and the education was worth the cost. But some lessons could only be learned through pain. As he walked to the boardroom, but employees at every level greeted him with genuine warmth. The maintenance workers waved, the administrative assistants smiled, the junior executives nodded respectfully, but all of them knew that their CEO had walked in their shoes. He understood their challenges, their frustrations, their dreams, but more than that, he valued their contributions. In the end, but the story wasn't about a billionaire who disguised himself as a janitor. It was about a man who learned that power without compassion was tyranny, that wealth without character was emptiness, and that the measure of a person's worth had nothing to do with their position on an organizational chart. But those lessons had cost him a marriage and 5 years of his life. Whether that price was too high remained to be seen, but Daniel had no regrets. He had become the leader his grandfather had envisioned, but more than that, he had become a man who treated others with the dignity they deserved, regardless of whether they could do anything for him. But that was the truest measure of success. And Jessica? But she had her expensive condo and her designer furniture and her impressive title. But every night when she came home to empty rooms filled with beautiful things, she understood that she had traded the only real treasure she had ever possessed for fool's gold. But understanding came too late for some lessons. The story ended not with reconciliation or revenge, but with the quiet satisfaction of integrity maintained and dignity preserved on both sides. But life rarely provided the neat conclusions that fiction promised, and perhaps that was as it should be. 2 years had passed since the divorce, but the reverberations of that conference room confrontation still shaped lives in unexpected ways. Daniel stood on the rooftop terrace of Titanium Holdings' newest acquisition, a converted industrial building in Brooklyn that now housed affordable artist studios and community spaces. But the project had been his passion for the past 18 months. The sunset painted the Manhattan skyline in shades of amber and rose, but his thoughts were on the dedication ceremony scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. "Mr. Cooper, the guests are starting to arrive," his assistant Rachel announced, but she had transitioned from the maintenance crew to his executive team seamlessly. She held a tablet displaying the evening's schedule, but her smile suggested she had additional news. "And there's someone here who wasn't on the guest list. She's asking to speak with you privately." But her tone indicated she knew exactly who it was. Daniel didn't need to ask, but he nodded toward the corner of the terrace where they could have privacy. Jessica appeared moments later, but she looked nothing like the woman who had served him divorce papers. Her hair was shorter, her clothing simpler, but something in her eyes had changed, a depth that came from genuine transformation rather than calculated reinvention. "I almost didn't come," Jessica admitted, but she kept a respectful distance. "I know this is your moment and I don't want to intrude, but I saw the article in the Times about this project and I needed to see it for myself." But her interest seemed genuine rather than opportunistic. The building below them hummed with activity. Artists setting up installations, community leaders greeting donors, children from the neighborhood exploring the new recreational spaces. But the transformation from abandoned warehouse to thriving community center had taken vision and substantial capital. Daniel had funded it entirely from his personal wealth, but the project wasn't about tax breaks or publicity. "You're not intruding," Daniel said, but he gestured toward the railing where they could watch the activity below. "How have you been?" But his question wasn't perfunctory. Jessica laughed, but the sound carried self-awareness rather than bitterness. "I quit Titanium Holdings 8 months ago, opened my own real estate firm specializing in affordable housing development." But she watched his face for a reaction. "I know it sounds like I'm copying you or trying to impress you, but honestly, watching what you've built here changed something in me. I realized I had been chasing the wrong kind of success my entire life." But her confession seemed to cost her something. "That's impressive," Daniel replied, but he meant it. "Affordable housing development is complicated work. The margins are thin, the regulations are Byzantine, but the impact is profound." But his respect was evident. "Exactly," Jessica said, but her enthusiasm was infectious. "I'm making about 30% of what I made at Titanium, but I actually feel good about my work for the first time in years. Last month, I helped a single mother secure a rent-stabilized apartment in a neighborhood with good schools. She cried when I gave her the keys, Daniel. She actually cried. But Jessica's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I had forgotten that real estate could change lives instead of just generating commissions. But her transformation seemed authentic. The rooftop door opened again, but this time Amanda emerged, followed by a tall woman with kind eyes and an infectious laugh. Daniel felt his face warm, but he couldn't suppress his smile. The woman was Dr. Maya Patel, a child psychologist who ran a nonprofit clinic in the South Bronx. But she had entered his life 6 months ago, when Titanium Holdings had donated funding for her organization's expansion. "There you are," Maya said, but she touched Daniel's arm with comfortable familiarity. "Your speech cards are still in your office. I had Rachel retrieve them before you went full-on improvisational." But her teasing was affectionate. Jessica's eyes widened, but recognition flashed across her face. "Maya Patel, I saw you interviewed on PBS about childhood trauma treatment. Your work is incredible." But Jessica's admiration was genuine. "Thank you," Maya replied, but she studied Jessica with a psychologist's perceptiveness. "You're Jessica Morrison, aren't you? Daniel's—" But she paused, searching for the appropriate term. "Ex-wife," Jessica supplied, but she said it without discomfort. "And before you worry, I'm not here to cause problems. I just wanted to see Daniel's project." But she looked between them with understanding dawning. "You two are together." But it wasn't a question. "We are," Daniel confirmed, but he took Maya's hand naturally. 6 months now, though we've been friends for about a year before that. But his happiness was evident. Maya squeezed his hand, but she addressed Jessica directly. "Daniel told me about everything. I hope this isn't awkward for you." But her concern seemed genuine. "It's not," Jessica said, but she surprised herself by meaning it. "Honestly, I'm glad he found someone who actually deserves him." But she looked at Daniel with something approaching peace. "Maya, can I ask you something? As a psychologist, I mean." But her question seemed important to her. "Of course," Maya replied, but she was intrigued. "How do you forgive yourself for being a terrible person?" Jessica asked, but vulnerability stripped away her usual defenses. "I mean, really forgive yourself, not just say the words, but actually move forward." But her question revealed years of struggle. Maya considered the question carefully, but she didn't offer easy platitudes. "I don't think we ever fully forgive ourselves for our worst mistakes, but we can acknowledge them, learn from them, and become someone different going forward. The person you were made choices based on the values you held then. The person you are now has different values, which means you'll make different choices." But her wisdom came from professional experience. The question isn't whether you can forgive who you were, but whether you can commit to being someone better. But her insight was profound. Jessica nodded slowly, but tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "I spent so much time being angry at myself for throwing away something real because I was too shallow to recognize it, for hurting someone who only ever treated me with kindness, for valuing all the wrong things." But her pain was palpable. "You're doing the work now," Daniel said gently, but his compassion hadn't diminished. "That's what matters. You're building something meaningful with your affordable housing firm. You're making different choices. That's growth, Jessica." But his encouragement was sincere. Amanda, who had been standing quietly nearby, spoke up. "She's been in therapy for 18 months. Real therapy, not the kind where you complain about other people for an hour. She's actually confronting her issues." But Amanda's pride in her sister was evident. "The whole family has changed. Jessica added, but she wanted Daniel to know. Dad retired early and started volunteering with a financial literacy nonprofit in underserved communities. Mom reduced her hours and actually started spending time with her grandchildren. Thomas implemented profit sharing in his department, and Christopher is now the head of the pro bono division at his firm. But the transformations had been comprehensive. I heard about some of those changes, Daniel admitted, but he was pleased. I'm glad they found their way to something more meaningful, but his generosity of spirit remained consistent. The dedication ceremony began with short speeches from city officials and community leaders, but Daniel's address was the most anticipated. He spoke about his grandfather's vision, about the importance of using resources to build rather than simply accumulate, but he also spoke about the lessons he had learned from working in maintenance, seeing the city from the perspective of those who kept it running rather than those who simply profited from it. This building represents what's possible when we measure success by impact rather than profit margins, Daniel said, but his voice carried across the crowded space. When we understand that true wealth is measured in strengthened communities, in opportunities created, in lives transformed. But his philosophy had been hard-won through personal experience. My grandfather once told me that character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you, but I would add that legacy is what you build that outlasts you. But he gestured to the building around them. This is just the beginning. But his vision extended far beyond one project. Maya watched him with obvious pride, but Jessica watched with something more complex, a mixture of regret and genuine happiness for him. She had loved the wrong version of Daniel, or perhaps she had loved the idea of him without truly seeing him. But she could appreciate who he had become, even if she could no longer be part of his journey. After the ceremony, but the crowd mingled in the gallery space where local artists had displayed their work. Richard Morrison approached Daniel cautiously, but his former father-in-law looked older and somehow softer than he had 2 years ago. Daniel, I won't take much of your time, Richard began, but his humility was hard-earned. I just wanted to tell you that what you've built here is remarkable, and I wanted to apologize again for how I treated you, not just because of who you turned out to be, but because no one deserves to be treated the way I treated people. But his apology went deeper than their personal history. I appreciate that, Richard, Daniel replied, but he shook the older man's hand. How's retirement treating you? But his question was genuine. It's teaching me things I should have learned decades ago, Richard admitted, but his smile was rueful. Like that, the best hours of my day are spent teaching teenagers about compound interest and budget planning. Who knew? But his transformation seemed real. Catherine joined them, but she looked lighter somehow, as if she had put down a burden she had carried too long. Daniel, this building is extraordinary, and Maya seems wonderful. I'm happy for you. But her words were simple and sincere. Thank you, Catherine, Daniel said, but he included both of them in his next statement. I hope you know that I never wanted to hurt your family. I just needed to understand who people really were. But his original motivation remained unchanged. You held up a mirror, Catherine replied, but she didn't flinch from the reflection. And we didn't like what we saw, but that was necessary. But her acceptance was mature. As the evening progressed, but Daniel found himself surrounded by people from every chapter of his life. Former maintenance crew colleagues who had become friends, business leaders who respected his vision, community members whose lives had been touched by his projects, but most importantly by people who valued him for who he was rather than what he owned. Maya found him near midnight, but most of the guests had departed. Tired? She asked, but she already knew the answer. Exhausted, Daniel admitted, but he pulled her close. But it's the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from building something that matters. But his satisfaction was evident. Your grandfather would be proud, Maya said, but she looked up at the stars barely visible above the city lights. Not just of what you've built, but of who you've become. But her assessment was what mattered most to him. I hope so, Daniel replied, but he felt the weight of legacy and responsibility. Sometimes I wonder if the 5 years in disguise were worth the cost. I lost my marriage. I delayed my career. But Maya cut him off with a gentle finger to his lips. You gained wisdom, she interrupted, but her eyes were fierce. You gained empathy. You gained perspective that most people in your position never acquire. And yes, you lost a marriage, but Daniel, you lost a marriage that was built on false foundations. If Jessica had known who you really were from the beginning, she might have stayed, but you never would have known if she loved you or your bank account. But her logic was irrefutable. When did you become so wise? Daniel teased, but his love for her was evident. I think I was born this way, Maya replied, but her grin was mischievous. It's why you're lucky to have me, but her confidence was earned. Jessica emerged from the shadows, but she had been waiting for a private moment. I'm going to head out, but Daniel, I wanted to say... She paused, but she struggled to find the right words. Thank you for not letting my worst moment define me in your eyes, for being generous when you could have been vindictive, for showing me that there's a different way to live. But her gratitude was complete. You did the work, Daniel reminded her, but he was proud of her transformation. I just provided a catalyst. The change came from you. But his encouragement was sincere. Jessica turned to Maya, but her expression was earnest. Take care of him. He's one of the rare good ones. But her blessing was genuine. I intend to, Maya replied, but she smiled warmly. And Jessica, good luck with your housing development firm. The city needs more people doing that work. But her support was real. After Jessica left, but Amanda lingered for a final moment. She's going to be okay, Amanda told Daniel, but she wanted him to know. It took her a while to get there, but she's genuinely different now. She's dating someone, actually, a high school teacher who coaches basketball on the side. He makes about $45,000 a year, and she's happier with him than I ever saw her with Gregory or... She stopped, but the implication was clear. I'm glad, Daniel said, but he meant it. Everyone deserves to find their path, even if it takes them a while to discover it. But his generosity remained constant. You're annoyingly magnanimous, you know that? Amanda teased, but she hugged him tightly. I'm proud to have known you, Daniel Cooper, even if my sister was too blind to appreciate you when it mattered. But her affection was sisterly. 3 hours later, but Daniel and Maya sat in his penthouse apartment, a space he had purchased after the divorce, but it was decorated with warmth rather than ostentation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the city, but the furniture was comfortable rather than impressive. Photos of meaningful moments lined the walls rather than expensive art, but the space reflected who Daniel had become rather than who people expected him to be. Do you ever regret it? Maya asked, but she was curled against his side on the couch. The 5 years undercover, the sacrifice, the whole experience. But her question was curious rather than judgmental. Daniel considered carefully, but he wanted to be honest. I regret that Jessica got hurt. I regret that her family had to confront such an uncomfortable truth about themselves. But do I regret the experience itself? No, but his conviction was solid. Those 5 years taught me things that no MBA or executive training program could have conveyed. I learned what it feels like to be dismissed, to be invisible, to have your contributions overlooked because of your position rather than your performance. But his education had been profound, and that made you a better leader, Maya finished, but she understood him completely. It made me a better human being, Daniel corrected, but he kissed the top of her head. Leadership is just the application of that lesson in a corporate context. But his philosophy was integrated into every aspect of his life. I have something to tell you, Maya said, but her tone had shifted to something nervous, and I'm not sure how you're going to react. But her anxiety was palpable. Daniel sat up, but concern flooded through him. What's wrong? But he was already preparing for bad news. Nothing's wrong, Maya assured him, but she took his hands in hers. My clinic received a massive grant, enough to expand our services to 3 additional locations across the city. We can help hundreds more children who are dealing with trauma, abuse, and mental health crises. But her excitement was building. The grant came from an anonymous donor, but Daniel, the paperwork had your grandfather's foundation listed as the fiscal sponsor. But her eyes searched his face. Daniel felt his throat tighten, but he hadn't expected Maya to discover his involvement so quickly. I might have made some recommendations to the foundation board about worthy causes deserving support, but his understatement was deliberate. Daniel Benjamin Cooper, Maya said, but tears were streaming down her face. Did you just donate enough money to triple my clinic's capacity? But her voice broke. The foundation donated, Daniel clarified, but he was uncomfortable with her gratitude. I just pointed them in the right direction. Your work is extraordinary, Maya. You're saving children's lives every single day. That deserves support. But his reasoning was characteristic. This is going to change everything, Maya whispered, but she was overwhelmed. Do you understand what this means? We can hire more therapists, extend our hours, offer services in multiple languages, provide care to families who have been on our waiting list for months. But she couldn't continue through her tears. Daniel held her, but his own eyes were wet. Then it's the best investment I've ever made. But his satisfaction was deeper than any business success. This is what wealth is supposed to do, Maya. It's supposed to multiply impact, amplify good work, create opportunities where none existed before. But his philosophy was lived rather than merely stated. They sat in comfortable silence, but the city sparkled below them like a carpet of diamonds. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape, but Jessica was probably lying awake in her expensive condo, wrestling with the ghost of who she used to be. Richard was perhaps reading financial literacy curricula for his next volunteer session, but he was building a different kind of legacy than the one he had once pursued. Catherine was maybe video calling her grandchildren, but she was learning that time was more valuable than productivity. Thomas and Christopher were hopefully sleeping peacefully, but they were living according to values they had discovered late but embraced fully. And Daniel. But he had everything he had never known he needed: meaningful work, genuine love, a sense of purpose that extended beyond personal gain, but most importantly, the wisdom to recognize these gifts when they appeared. He had been wealthy before, but he had been poor in the ways that mattered. But now, sitting with Maya in their comfortable apartment, surrounded by evidence of lives touched and communities strengthened, he understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. I love you, Maya said suddenly, but her voice was fierce with certainty. Not because of your money or your success or your charitable foundations, but because you see people, Daniel, really see them. You saw me when I was just another nonprofit director looking for funding, but you recognized the work as worthy before you recognized me as someone you could love. But her distinction was important. I love you too, Daniel replied, but his voice was thick with emotion. You remind me every day why the work matters. why compassion isn't weakness, and why empathy is the foundation of everything worthwhile. But she had become his moral compass in ways that humbled him. The epilogue to Daniel's story wasn't about vindication or revenge or even reconciliation, but it was about transformation, his own and that of everyone whose life he had touched. The maintenance worker had become a CEO, but more importantly, the man who had been betrayed had become someone who built bridges instead of burning them. But perhaps the most profound transformation was the simplest one. He had learned to measure wealth by the depth of his relationships and the breadth of his impact rather than the size of his bank account. And in the end, but that made him richer than he had ever been before. As dawn broke over Manhattan, but Daniel and Maya remained curled together on the couch, discussing plans for the clinic's expansion and the foundation's next projects. The future stretched before them, filled with possibility, but it was grounded in lessons learned through pain and humiliation, and ultimately through grace. But that was perhaps the greatest gift of Daniel's 5-year journey. He had descended into anonymity and emerged with something far more valuable than the status he had temporarily surrendered. He had emerged with wisdom, with purpose, but most importantly with love that was freely given rather than conditionally offered. But that was a treasure that no divorce papers could ever take away.